Good evening and welcome to our final broadcast of 2020. Tonight we're discussing the government's policy towards asylum seekers, particularly during this COVID crisis. And I'm joined this evening by investigative journalist and broadcaster Shadia Edwards-Dashti. And we're hoping that author and former asylum seeker Faith Gakanje, who's written about her experiences, will also be able to join us at some point during the programme. But I wonder if then obviously I could start with you, Shadia, and just ask if you could take us through what you discovered when you were looking at the situation at the Napier barracks in Folkestone, which has been converted, as I understand it, to house asylum seekers there. I know you made a short film about that. Walk us through what you discovered when you went there.
Well, firstly, I just want to say thank you very much for having me on this evening and to use your platform to discuss more at length how difficult it's been for asylum seekers, not just in 2020, but for a long time. This year, for majority of people in 2020, has been so difficult because of the COVID-19 pandemic, exacerbated by the COVID-19 pandemic. The Tory government, you name it, it's been a really challenging year for majority of people, but none more so than asylum seekers. Obviously, there's no such thing as furlough when it comes to asylum seekers. There's no such thing as universal credit. It really is, you get what you're given. My team, we went to Folkestone, Napier Barracks. It's a former ex-military base in Folkestone, serving as a temporary assessment centre for asylum seekers. Around 400 asylum seekers are being placed there. Majority all men, and majority of them have travelled, made that perilous journey across the English Channel. Of course, we saw in the summer this huge wave of the refugee crisis once again, and those are the people that are now living in Napier Barracks. People may say, well, it's a roof over their head, but if that roof is a torturous one, I don't use that word lightly, if that roof is a bad one, then that's a roof you don't really want to be under. We had heard in the media that, not in the media, but in some sort of forms of social media, and various different reports and allegations were coming out of this facility that made us want to go and look into it further. And from the very get-go, it was worse than we really could have even imagined. We arrived in pretty much the middle of nowhere. It's outside of Dover. It's in Folkestone. Really was a military campsite around us, and it was bleak, incredibly bleak. You have to think, if you've just got off a boat and you're now being exposed to this area, you're going to think, what is going on? Immediately, what hit me was a fence, barbed wire on top. Really worse than a military site. It felt very like prison, being detained. These sort of prison-like connotations came to mind. But one of the biggest images that came to mind was what we've seen maybe in the border in America with Mexico, people being caged like animals. That's the first thing that came to my mind when I went to Napier Barracks.
Really, yeah. I mean, and I think you spoke to some of the locals, didn't you? And to sort of assess their response to Napier Barracks being used in that way. What was the kind of reaction that you found from local people?
Well, it was really, really quite shocking. As soon as we got out of the car, we went over to the barracks, and a man from within the barracks, he really started waving and screaming, help, help. He obviously saw my camera guy with a camera, so he wanted to draw us to him. And so I went over to him. I tried to talk to him. He gestured to go around the other side of the barracks, so we followed him there. And as soon as we were in a place where we would be able to converse through the fence, we were hit by security guards, and they made it absolutely impossible for anybody to speak about anything. Even me saying hello, they were trying to stop any forms of communication. I asked them, why can't they speak to us? Is there an issue? They're not being detained. They're not criminals. This is a free country. Why can't they answer my questions, or indeed tell me what they want to say? And the security guard called for backup. More security came, and they just ushered them away back into the facility. So it was hostile from the very get-go. It really felt like, what is going on inside there that you won't let anybody communicate? I mean, it really was very alarming. It got very tense, and we had just been there potentially 2 minutes, not even.
Yeah, I mean, the sense I got from watching the extended film that you did, and which is about 15 minutes long. I mean, I posted it on my Twitter feed, and we'll put a link out to it again because it's quite instructive. It seemed they were being treated almost as if they were prisoners, were criminals. I mean, is that the sense that you came away with? I guess it must be, really.
Absolutely. We contacted the Home Office, who said to us, they're not criminals, they're not being detained, they're there just to seek asylum. But from the imagery, from what the people were saying to us, from everything else, it really did feel like they were being punished for something. Of course, seeking asylum is not a crime. Traveling across the channel should not, you should not have to be put into a facility like that. It felt like they were being imprisoned. It felt like they had committed some sort of crime, because they were certainly being treated like prisoners. And many people I spoke to, everybody used that word prison, everybody. And many people said it was worse than prison. It just felt like a very, like, this is the hostile environment people talk of. You see in the papers, you see in the media, hostile environment. And this is it. These facilities across the country, I have only been to Napier Barracks, but that is the hostile environment that we're talking about here when it comes to immigration and asylum seeking.
Who's running the facility, Shadia? I mean, is it privately run, or is it a government?
So it's a body that's the Home Office, but the people that run it is a private company. So they're being employed by the Home Office to facilitate the accommodation services within the barracks itself. The interesting point, though, in all of this is that as a volunteer, I was not a volunteer, but I'll move on to Adam, who was a volunteer that I was close with, who took us there. Every single volunteer that goes towards this barracks is now forced to sign a confidentiality form. It's essentially underpinned by the Official Secrets Act, and it basically obligates the signatory to keep silent, keep stum about anything they see about the service user. The service user is the asylum seeker. So essentially, by signing this waiver, you are therefore not allowed to speak about what asylum seekers are going through within the barracks. And to just pay more attention to the fact it's the Official Secrets Act. That's not, that's something that's designed to do with national security.
Well, one would have thought so, yeah.
Yeah.
Although we've seen it being abused in a number of different circumstances, this is just another example. I mean, one of the things I'm particularly interested in, and obviously we build it as such in the advertising for this discussion this evening, is how asylum seekers are being treated in the middle of this pandemic. I mean, what sense did you get in relation to health and safety precautions that may or may not have been taken with the asylum seekers that were accommodated at this place?
So it really did feel like one rule for some and another rule for others. You know, let's try and be COVID compliant in all forms outside of something to do with asylum seekers. But then when it came to the barracks itself, it seemed like there was nothing COVID compliant within there at all. For instance, there's around 30 people sleeping in the same room. Obviously, they're not all from the same household. So this is all a real big COVID concern. The fact that it's not addressed, the fact that the police stopped me later in the day for doing what I was doing. And they said, oh, they just want to make sure I am COVID compliant. I said to them, what about what's going on in the barracks? If you want to talk about COVID compliancy, let's talk about the barracks. They said, no, that's nothing to do with us. We're just here to make sure that you're COVID compliant. So it's a serious concern, health and safety within there, particularly to do with COVID. We're also talking about people mixing all day. They're saying that there are COVID cases in there. And of course, that's going to spread. It doesn't seem like there was any concern about these people, which just really does exacerbates the point and highlights the point that these people are not treated like human beings. They don't come under the COVID compliancy because the government doesn't care about them. which just makes it feel all. It just adds to that sense that they are being treated as subhuman.
Yes, indeed. I mean, the media reportage in general, no aspersions being cast on you as a journalist, but in the corporate media, the demonization of asylum seekers has I think, led to a degree of ill-informed bigotry from some residents. I mean, not just in Kent, in Folkestone and Dover and places, but really throughout the land. I mean, we've been fed a diet almost on a daily basis, certainly for a long, prolonged period anyway, of this demonization of asylum seekers. And I know that you did speak to some of the people living in the locality. Just tell us what the sort of reaction you got from people to the facility and just their general attitude towards asylum seekers.
I have to say, so on 2 occasions I've reported in Dover and Folkestone, like, extensively, and this time around Napier Barracks, it felt a lot more hostile. But you have to also understand, exactly as you said, it's the mainstream media, it's social media exacerbating these sort of ideology, this sort of like notion. It's racist rhetoric at the end of the day. It really is, and it's misinformed, and you just got it straight away. I was filming, and a man just shouted over the fence, over a fence of the park, saying, they're disgusting, send them home. And you just stop and think, I'm Arab myself, and it really hits home. And you're speaking to these people that have risked their life to be here. They are in really desperate situations to be here. And instead of people welcoming them and supporting them, being compassionate, the absolute worst. And they really have, I just saw some and heard some atrocious language being spewed, really atrocious language. Having said that, the time that I was there in the summer, it felt very, very split, more in Dover on the beach side. And it was really split. You either got people spouting vile venom, or you got really heartwarming comments saying, what would you do? It really did feel split. And I think the context, when you talk about anybody coming to the United Kingdom, you now have to, unfortunately, place it in the context of Brexit and the political context of it as well. And Dover is overwhelmingly supported Brexit, 62.2%. So, and who is the spearhead of that in the Dover region? It's Nigel Farage. He's constantly there, walking up and down, talking to people, and it plays a part. And he's the pin-up doll for it. And then these followers saying the same.
Well, certainly there's been a process of dehumanisation. I think that's pretty clear, and it extends well beyond the whole Brexit debate. I mean, it's been going on forever, it seems to me, but it has ramped up certainly over the last few years. There's no doubt about that. And interesting, you're talking about your Arab heritage. I saw a really interesting documentary, I think made a few years ago, about just the way in which the Arab culture as how it's portrayed in, not just in terms of the kind of press and broadcast media, but just even things like Hollywood and so on, and how people, Arabs, are portrayed. We've seen this, I mean, since time immemorial, and it's interesting as well. I mean, one of the things that they were pointing out in this documentary is the imagery, the cartoon, the caricature type imagery, very, very similar when you compare them to the kind of Nazi imagery that was used against the Jews to dehumanize and create that sort of hatred towards Jews. This othering is something that we do need to rail against, because our enemies, those of us who are concerned about issues of living standards, etc., in this country, our enemies are not migrants. I mean, the people that are responsible for the inequalities in society are the faceless corporations, the self-same people that are often behind some of the exploitation and wars that have led people to flee in desperate circumstances. So on that note, let me just move now. I'm delighted that Faith has been able to join us now. Faith Gakanje, she herself is an author, an activist, entrepreneur. She was also, though, as I understand it, an asylum seeker. And I believe, Faith, it took you 8 years to get your asylum application sorted out. So perhaps you could just maybe start by telling us how you coped, how you managed, during that 8-year period. It must have been incredibly traumatic.
It was a difficult. Oh, hi, Chris. Hi, Shadia. Nice to join you guys. And I'm happy to be here tonight to explore the gray areas of asylum and the limbo that we are going through. As an asylum seeker myself, for those 8.5 years that I struggled in the UK, I really had a tough time because I had left my children back home. So having separated with those children for that particular time, it was difficult for me to navigate within the UK. However, it has been the challenges that comes with the immigration policies, and it was very difficult for me to sort of understand as a Black African woman who had limited education then. It was so difficult to understand as well as to how things can now be benefit me to help my children as well whom I left home. So it was quite challenging, to be sincere.
Yes, I can imagine. And I'm just wondering, actually, because your audio is not great, Faith, and I'm wondering whether or not it might be because, both myself and Shadia for a time had our microphones on, and I think we might be getting a bit of feedback. Faith, Shadia, I just wonder when Faith is speaking, if you could maybe mute, and I'll mute as well, because I did mute mine halfway through, Faith, and it did sort of slightly improve the quality of the audio. But perhaps I could just ask then, Faith, I mean, what your thoughts are about the way in which the government has been handling the whole issue of asylum in this country, and in particular in relation to the impact that it's having in relation to the COVID crisis, and how you feel, in your experience, asylum seekers are being treated at this very difficult time. We've just spoken to Shadia. I don't know if you picked up what she was saying, but she's been reporting from Kent and the Napier barracks in particular, where it's been converted to accommodate asylum seekers, and there didn't seem to be any health and safety procedures in place at all for the asylum seekers now in the middle of this pandemic. What's your experience with some of the work that you're doing now in regards to that?
Having joined the sector in 2006, working with women refugees and asylum seekers, then the challenges of reporting to detention center, the enforcement that comes with that, it is very difficult for women even to get to travel to those centers that they are expected to report. And it is challenging in the sense that some of the women, we came at the age of in our 40s, and some of us we came in our 30s, but being locked in the state of limbo for a period of 10 years plus, it is quite difficult. And it can be the trauma, the mental health issues that we are now experiencing. Most of the women cannot cope again, and we have been dismantled within the system. It is very difficult for me to even measure or to tell the story of another woman while I am not even able to tell my own story. It is difficult in the sense that different women and different people are affected differently. And as I have a passion working with women, I am now finding myself working with men more than women, because they are struggling more than women, because women we could get to be understood maybe differently than men. So most of the asylum seekers who have been here for 19 years do not have their papers still. And you wonder what's going on with the systems. No matter how much evidence you provide to them, I think there is a gap that needs to be looked into for them to rectify the issues and the problems that asylum seekers are going through.
Well, certainly. I mean, when I was a member of Parliament, I mean, I assisted quite a number of asylum seekers, and we had a direct line to like a hotline, as it were, to the Home Office, where we were able to make representations. And I'm pleased to say that we were able to assist a number of people and expedite their application and get things resolved. But for every one individual that came to me for assistance, there are many, many others who didn't have the wherewithal for whatever reason to seek the assistance of their local member of parliament. And regrettably, in my experience, all too many members of parliament are not sympathetic anyway. So even where people have sought help from their MP, that help hasn't been particularly forthcoming. I mean, they've been treated very often as second-class citizens, where when asylum seekers turned up to the MP surgery for advice and assistance, they were not dealt with by the MP. They were made to sort of wait in a separate area. This is happened locally, and it certainly happened in other parts of the country that to my certain knowledge. And the MP wouldn't see them. They're just told, well, you just fill in this form. And they were treated very, very badly. There was no kind of personal touch at all. And we absolutely took a totally different approach, myself and my team. You know, we very much wanted, because we understood, you know, people have come from incredibly traumatic and difficult circumstances often. And, you know, we wanted to show a bit of kind of, you know, human kindness in that sense. And I know that people as asylum seekers are not allowed to work. And, you know, often people come to my surgery and they were destitute. I mean, on more than a few occasions, we ended up, you know, giving them some groceries, as it were, to try and get through the weekend. But I mean, obviously, that's just a stopgap short-term measure. Just on that point, Faith, I mean, how did you manage for all that time not being able to work on incredibly minimal resources that made at your disposal? I mean, incredibly tenacious for you to have kind of got through that, and you're a real success story. We'll just get into that in a bit, if you don't mind, in terms of, you know, how you've managed to you know, make a success since your application was resolved. But just on that specific point, though, Faith, in relation to, you know, just coping on a day-to-day basis, just unpack that a little bit for us, just to kind of let our viewers know how difficult life is for asylum seekers, because many people have a rather inflated view about the you know how asylum seekers are treated. I mean, I've heard apocryphal stories. People come to me and say, "Well, they get given cars and a house and, you know, hundreds of pounds a week to live on," and of course we know that's complete nonsense. So just tell us the reality.
It is the problem is when you are an asylum seeker and when your case is refused, the local authority have no duty of care. So it is that creates destitution among people who are of asylum. I became a destitute 3 times during the 8 years and a half I was seeking asylum. And it became so difficult at some point, in a way that I lived in an old police building where there was no electricity, where there was no energy, no water. And I remember sourcing water from another building in a bucket on a daily basis, and it was a period of 6 months. So because I had to find a way of changing my life and to make things better for others, I joined the voluntary sector and set up an organization called the African Women Empowerment Forum. In that organization, it's when I started to understand how social policy are aiming to deliver and to save people in a positive way, but at a local level, during delivery, they tend to fail the people that they are aiming to save. So I then started to work with women and advocate for change. And it's that change we created under that organization. So in terms of making things happen, it is very difficult because we came with the complex of languages and we come with different cultures. So for me to attract funding, it was also difficult because I could not write a bid myself and people could not understand what I was trying to do. Oh, poor asylum, oh, poor this. But, you know, as an entrepreneur myself, I then had to transfer my skills that I had come with to fashion, to making things happen, and to start helping other people, making use of my skills, helping them with little English and making clothes and sewing programs. Those things created a change to women's lives. Most of them, and even men, they would come and eat when we were running our activities. So it created that cohesiveness of asylum seekers and the platform to us to start talking about our stories, getting advice from each other. So it is not easy as an asylum seeker if you cannot speak English. It is very difficult. But if you are now being separated from other asylum seekers, the tendency of dispersing asylum seekers all over the place, you are not matched with the people that you know, or that you where you take those who come from your country. So that makes it also difficult in terms of integration. So asylum seekers are facing very high challenges during COVID time. This is where the story is, and this is where the great areas are. Most of the women or most of the asylum seekers who came 2001, 2002, most of them who has no papers still are now mentally confused. So those challenges now that the country or the UK has to face, and most of it, it's the community that is now facing those challenges because they see these people on a daily basis. Home office does not live with us. So asylum seekers are now a burden to the community rather, because they are not mainstreamed. Most of them, they have no access to public records. So you cannot signpost them to go on benefits or to go everywhere. I remember when COVID started, I had a lady signposted to my office, and this lady is an asylum seeker. She was a destitute. She had just lost her accommodation 3 weeks before COVID broke. So for me to take her to my property, I had to stay for 3 months with this particular lady because nobody was responding. So it is very, very difficult during this time. Everything is happening in isolation, social distance to them. When it comes to reporting to detention centers or to reporting centers, it is quite challenging because with little resources that they have, we have to give them expenses to go to report, and the system is not that sympathetic. It is very terrible. People are facing very much challenges during this COVID time. They cannot feed themselves, and to collect food from one point to the other, they have to walk to those centers. Sometimes they do not have money to travel. So it is very difficult for people to meet up with the demands given COVID-19 challenges as well. You are muted, Chris.
Thanks, Faith. I should be on top of that. I'm supposed to be hosting things, Benny. Sorry about that. I'm just saying that one of the important things is to, for those of us, more enlightened on these issues, is to, try and get those human stories out there, really, to sort of, humanize asylum seekers, because they've been dehumanized by the media. The government policy, this hostile environment that they've created has contributed to that. And so I think it's important that we do everything we can. And I know Shadia has been, doing her best to fulfill that role. But just want to go back to Shadia. I mean, you've written a book, haven't you, Faith, about your experiences, and it might be just useful to maybe just give that a plug, because I just think that's quite useful. There we go. Excellent. Yeah, just hold it up a bit higher because it's slightly obscured by your name on the screen. So if people can see that, A Life Robbed. Well worth getting, I think, because it's quite useful just to sort of hear, as it were, from somebody's direct experiences. And, the more that we can try and get those human stories out there, I think the better. I mean, there's a great little project in my own city, actually, that is doing just that, really, bringing asylum seekers together, and they've got people that they've been working with to articulate their story, and then trying to share that around. But it's a difficult task in some ways, because you're fighting against that narrative in the mainstream media. But Shadia, I mean, there's an interesting project. Maybe you might be interested in doing some reportage about the African Women's Empowerment Forum. But you just on going back to what you were reporting on in relation to the situation in Folkestone, but you've also been looking at situation in Dover as well, and I know you wanted to say a little bit about what you discovered there.
Yeah, just before I do, I just wanted to comment on a bit of what Faith was saying.
Of course, yes, absolutely, feel free, yeah.
Particularly about maybe men, because obviously Napier Barracks is predominantly just men, and we've seen so many people talking about suicide and talking about how difficult it is. And there's the latest statistics now is that 29 asylum seekers have died in home office accommodation so far this year. That is 5 times as many people who have died trying to get here. So we're talking about some really severe statistics. While somebody is in supposedly the safe haven of the United Kingdom, Faith's talking destitution, poverty. We're supposed to be the country that looks after people with civil liberties and protections in place. Yet while in the home office accommodation, 29 people have died this year, which would be majority men as well. So I think Faith does make hugely valid points, and I saw it for myself. Grown men crying, and they said they didn't cry when they were getting here, as scary as that was, but it was the Home Office's conditions that brought them to tears and to break down, and that was their breaking point, really. So I think
that's a terrible indictment, I think, on Britain, isn't it?
Absolutely. I mean, it's an indictment on Britain. It's an indictment on the Human Rights Convention. It's an indictment on everything that we're supposed to hold up high and credit. What I have witnessed, what Faith is explaining of her situation, which is not just her, it should shame us all to be part of this country that's doing something like that. It should shame everybody to hear stories like this. But the situation in Dover as well. I did go to Dover, and I went to a children's facility. So that's anybody that's under the age of 18. And there, I think they're in an equally very, very vulnerable situation. They've come alone. They've come with nothing, essentially. But their situation is just as bad, because not only are they waiting to be processed, but as well they could be sent back, and they're more vulnerable to being sent back because they're also young people too. So we have loads of different situations, and in Dover, as soon as, again, similar situation, I went to the facility, and the security came out to me and said, you can't speak to them, they're children, you can't speak to them. As if, under what law is it illegal to speak to a child? I don't know this law. So I said, I'm not filming, the cameraman's in the car. I know the law. I'm not filming. I am on my own here trying to talk to somebody. You can't film them. It's so hostile from the very get-go. It's it's like, who are you, is what they're saying to me. And I said, look, I understand if you're trying to protect these children. That's one thing, but it's another thing trying to silence them. They're two very different things.
I mean, we as you probably know, Shadia, we're trying to build a grassroots movement, a resistance movement, and we've got a lot of activists have signed up in the southeast of the country. Obviously, Kent being one of those areas. I don't know whether you feel able, actually, as a journalist, but speaking as a human being and seeing what you've witnessed, I mean, what sort of things do you think they might be able to do to try and, I don't know, draw the attention to the wider public in the area about what's happening? Or what could local activists do you think, to try and
I think
A lot of asylum seekers, because it sounds absolutely awful what you've witnessed. I mean, and we've heard from Faith what she experienced. I mean, this is disgusting in the United Kingdom. This is happening.
The problem is, it's sort of like here they're just thrown and plonked into various pockets across the country. That's not a way to do it. You know, you're supposed to welcome and I don't want to use the word assimilate. I don't understand this word assimilate, but try and encourage people to be part of the society rather than just thrown in a cage, lock away the key. This is another reason why we've got a lot of hostility in areas like Folkestone, like where I went, because it's a small town and you plonk a strange facility and you plonk 500 people there. It's going to cause concern regardless of whatever you may think. It is going to cause a bit of alarm. So it's about really trying to welcome people in. When I met these kids, I saw them in the park playing football. I play football. First thing I did was say, pass me the ball. And we started playing football before anything else. So I'd encourage people to just ask them, find something that there's a common denominator. You know, you don't have to go straight to, oh, you came across the channel. No, you know, they're all human beings. We're all from somewhere, and there's always a common factor, and you can find that. I found it in a football, and I was able to play football and have a great afternoon with them before even talking about their story. You know, maybe people don't talk about their story, but it's about making people feel comfortable and making people feel welcome. And that's the absolute bottom line, I think. It's not about us versus them. It's not even about you can become one of us, because we should become one of them.
Yeah, I mean, it's common sense from what you're saying, Shadia. I mean, it's interesting because just on personal experience, I used to be a councillor in Derby before I became the Member of Parliament, and it was an inner city area that I represented. And there was some tension, it's got to be said. I mean, I'm going back about, 15 years or more ago now, in relation to asylum seekers. And one of the things that we did was to try and, as it were, bring people together and share kind of like just everyday activities, like you're just talking about playing football or whatever. It wasn't football, but it was, social events. And it was amazing, I'm not saying, there were no more tensions, but it did seem to, as it were, break down those barriers, and people could see people as people, and it was quite uplifting, really, because we'd gone from quite a pretty alarming state of affairs at a public meeting I attended to one, a few months later, where all that animosity had dissipated, and some of the people that they were complaining about, it wasn't just asylum seekers, it was migrants from Eastern Europe and so on who were there, were part of that meeting. They come along to the meeting, and so that was great and that was heartwarming. And I think anything that I guess local activists can do on the ground there to try and facilitate that would be useful. Before I go to Sean, just to get some thoughts of our viewers, comments or questions that they might have, I wonder, Faith, whether you've got any advice that you might give to people in relation to how they might tackle some of the bigotry that is around in relation to asylum seekers and migrants in general. Any thoughts on or advice on what people who are associated with our movement might be able to do to break down some of the animosity which undoubtedly is there, and to counter the media narrative which we get on a regular basis?
Basing on my own experience as a Black African woman myself, my experience with racism is also attached to Black refugees who are coming from Africa. So to navigate that, I think we need to work with the social media to change the narratives, making sure that, we highlight things in a positive way that are happening. I'm now an author, I'm an entrepreneur by nature, and I have really, really made an impact because I've built businesses in the UK. So with that, we need to keep connection and to keep in touch with each other, which is why I had also involved a project that I work with African communities, refugees and asylum seekers, to make sure they have a gadget, to make sure they have a telephone, a mobile phone, to make sure that they are online, to know things. because lockdown has come to isolate and to discriminate people. So if you don't have the right resources to connect you to the entire global society, you are really, really in lockdown because you are not able to access what other people can access or what they can take for granted. So it is the high time we need to understand that being an asylum seeker, it's not a disability. We can do things. So we need to connect and to closely work with media so that we change the narrative of the negativity that comes with asylum.
Absolutely. No, that's good advice. And thank you for that, Faith. Let me bring in Sean now and just sort of get some reaction from our viewers this evening to what you have both been saying and get any reaction to what our audience has to say. Over to you, Sean. Can you hear me, Sean? You're on.
Yeah, can you hear me okay? I've been having a few technical issues tonight. Can you hear me okay? Yeah, okay. Well, good evening to Shadia and Faith. It's lovely to meet you, and thank you for telling your stories this evening. We've posted out your link to the people watching, Faith, and hopefully people will purchase that. I know that's something that I'll be putting on my list over the new year. Okay, so there's a few comments come in that are quite shocking, really, about camps in Wales. Francis Kay said, at Penally Camp in Yenby, the security guards are confiscating cooked food made specially for refugees. A restaurant sent in meals for them, and they were all confiscated. This company is carrying out Patel's brutal, hostile environment to inordinate lengths. Which is shocking. And likewise, Shani Jones, who's in West Wales, says that a local restaurant made a Syrian banquet for the people in Penally Camp under all the necessary rules, and the security guards refused to distribute it and confiscated the food. Francis then went on to say that neo-fascist groups from South Wales have been demonstrating outside the camp, intimidating the men so they feel afraid to venture out. They're not prisoners, but they feel like prisoners. Are made to feel like prisoners, which is shocking. That's really shocking to me. John Atcher asks, or Atcher John says, can I ask, what does Faith want to see happen? What is the panacea to what is happening now?
Faith, any response to that?
I would like to see change in terms of the treatment that asylum seekers have to see. Obviously, I went through trauma, destitution, and poverty. And it is my wish or my hope to see change in the way asylum seekers and the way the cases are being processed. It has taken maybe some people 20 years. It has taken some people 11 years or 12 years. I don't think, and most of those people have now ended up being immigrants. We came as political refugees, and in the end, you are thrown away to be an immigrant. So it is that I would like to see change in terms of the processes, and it can only happen through empowering asylum seekers and refugees themselves to come together and be able to create that change.
Yeah. Sean, any more?
No, that's it for tonight, Chris. My personal thoughts, I was just thinking back in the week to a story that was going around that was posted by, I think it was the London Standard or the Metro, and they were talking about the government's plans to build camps with no running water or electricity to try and stop people from wanting to come over here, which just seemed absolutely barbaric. I don't know if Shadia read any of those stories and can comment on that.
So I think talking about these other facilities in Pembrokeshire, Penally, and there's various others in Hampshire, they're talking about setting up various different places. these allegations of cooked food not being able to go into the facility and being confiscated, they're not isolated allegations or claims. What I was told was the reason why certain things couldn't go into the facility is to do with COVID. It sounds a bit far-fetched to me. It might sound far-fetched to you as well, that cooked meals is somehow not COVID compliant, nor is clothes. Apparently it needs to go into some sort of quarantine. So there are ways and technicalities that maybe the Home Office is trying to justify this particular behaviour. But what I would say is that all of these things could be part of a wider plan to say, you're not welcome here. You know, if you look back to last year, Priti Patel, the Home Secretary, she said that she would, the route across the English Channel would become an infrequent phenomenon. This year, she says she wants to make the route entirely unviable. Then the British government and the French authorities decided to cut off the route entirely. So we're seeing all of these things coming into play from the political rhetoric, and it's now trickling down, and you're seeing it in various ways of like cooked can't come into a facility where cooked food is not provided. So you're seeing it becoming very hostile from the rhetoric trickling down to what asylum seekers are really experiencing. Even socks in Napier Barracks, they couldn't get clean socks into the facility, and it was because, oh, well, it's not COVID compliant. And then we said, this is a fresh pair of socks in a packet. There is no difference between getting this from the shop or on Amazon, delivered directly to the Napier Barracks, or me handing you a pair of fresh socks in a packet. But yet it's not COVID compliant. So I feel like it's totally intertwined with a larger rhetoric. And, you know, obviously these are like allegations, but I saw things like that myself.
The thing that concerns me, you know, Shadia, though, amongst many actually, is what you mentioned there about the likes of Priti Patel and some of the rhetoric that we're getting from government ministers, because I don't think it's overstating it, but that kind of hostile rhetoric, it kind of gives tacit approval to some of the kind of violent reactions that we are seeing directed against asylum seekers. And Sean mentioned some of the reactions that we've had from our audience this evening about, you know, demonstrations and so on outside. It's almost as if this kind of, you know, it's sort of tacit approval from senior government ministers. I mean, this is just shocking, isn't it?
I totally agree. I think saying we're going to cut off the route entirely and make a route unviable. Firstly, like, what does that even mean? What do you mean by you're going to make it unviable? It's just jargon, if that makes sense. It's rather than actual practicalities. You know, the idea of making it unviable, well, then make safe and legal passages, right? But no, unviable means nothing alone. But what it does do is gives, as you say, momentum to the far right, the neo-fascists organizing these sorts of groups. But it also gives a lot of legitimization and justification for the media to come out with headlines of take back control, Muslim takeover, swarms, flood, from the migrant crisis in 2015. But for a long time, you mentioned Orientalist rhetoric before. It's been around for a long time. It's still here to stay, but it's getting much more obvious and much more violent. Just in the latest refugee crisis in the summer, we had the Calais mayor saying it's maritime war, Nigel Farage saying it's sea invasion. All of these things, swarms, floods, very, very gruesome, brutal, obvious, hateful rhetoric, language being spewed onto the headlines, is also being, you know, you're given the green light to publish that by the likes of the heads of state, by coming out, cut off the route. You know, you've been given the AOK to publish that sort of stuff, and then the people that read that are the ones saying you're disgusting.
Absolutely. And of course, many of the people that are, you know, seeking asylum are victims of an imperialist foreign policy. I mean, if we didn't get involved in so many wars or support repressive regimes around the world, then people wouldn't be leaving their homeland. It's quite a big thing, isn't it, to uproot and leave your homeland. I mean, Faith, I guess it must have been an incredible trauma for you to uproot and seek asylum in a foreign land. I mean, I guess that wasn't your first choice in an ideal world.
To start with, being a Zimbabwean myself, I'm a very proud woman to be a Zimbabwean. I had no intention to come to the UK. Despite the problems that were going on in Zimbabwe then, it was also up to the United Kingdom to accept us and settle us on time without even making it a big deal. But it was shocking to me as a woman coming from Zimbabwe and the relationship that Zimbabwe had with the UK. It was so much degrading because I did not expect, I had very high hopes that I was going to join the Queen of England. She had once come to Zimbabwe and we were going to be fine, but we did not become that. We became something else. So yes, it is that makes me believe that even though social policy are designed to support people, there are many things that need to be considered at the local level, because I see that's where the problem is. The local authority does not support asylum group properly for them to make an impact or to get them granted leave to remain on time, because we wander in the city for a long time, despite how much you put in the voluntary sector to try to correct things, to evidence your work and to evidence the support. There is no support from the local authority. So I would think as well, there is a need for those local authorities in different cities to understand the plight that refugees and asylum seekers have come with and they are going through, and they need to assist them so that they stop the mental health and to actually support them to avoid the crisis of getting into that trauma.
Yeah, absolutely. Okay, well, listen, thank you very much indeed for your contributions this evening. It's been an interesting discussion, if a bit depressing on occasions, but I mean, I think it's also uplifting the fact that faith has got through the difficulties and is making a success of her life, despite the fact that it took her 8 years to actually achieve the status and get the asylum application resolved. So there is a source of hope, and I think it's incumbent on all of us to try and counter that appalling negative narrative that we see being spewed out from the pages of the gutter press on a daily basis, and indeed the rather irresponsible rhetoric that we're hearing from government ministers. So it's the end of the year. This is our last broadcast, as I was saying at the top of the show, for 2020. We'll be back, I think it's on the 6th of January, when we'll be discussing the Bolivian situation, the coup that took place there last year. And within 12 months, the people, through the effort of the labor movement and the wider civil society, essentially said they weren't prepared to accept this CIA-backed coup, and through a process of industrial action and civil disobedience, forced the right-wing regime to hold new elections, and the socialists came back with an even bigger majority than they'd achieved under Evo Morales in the elections that the American-backed right-wing dictatorship that took over didn't accept. And it was an incredibly uplifting story, and one I think which should inspire us in this country as we seek to overcome and resist some of the excesses of this government that we're discussing this evening, and many others as well. So thank you very much indeed for watching this evening. Let me wish you all a very happy Christmas, a peaceful new year, and I shall look forward to seeing you in the new year. So thank you and good night.